Okay, so good to see you all. Today's presentation is going to form part of four, maybe five parts, where we've taken a real deep dive into a number of areas around how the world was manipulated. And today's is going to be on self-perception theory. Now, it's a very, very fascinating subject, which is probably one of the most important subjects for all of us to understand because it will affect us every day and it will affect those around us. And the people pushing the propaganda understand this in detail. And you can see by how they've manipulated people when you understand it, that it's so key. And I'm glad that I'm here to share it this evening because it's so unbelievable. The truth often escapes being known. The truth about self-perception theory really is quite unbelievable. When I started to look into it, because I had a sort of summary of it a while ago, I kind of was reluctant to look into it because it, as I mentioned, it contradicted a lot of my existing beliefs. But with a lot of these things, when you get into detail, you'll see that actually two things can be true when they appear to be opposite. Now, it's so unbelievable that it acts as a stealth manipulation. And what I invite you all to do is to, after tonight's presentation over the coming weeks, just observe how it might affect people and start to look at the things that happened in the last 5 years. And I think you might be surprised to see how important this is. It's going to take some time to digest, and it's probably going to create a few uncomfortable feelings, which is fine because that's just your brain trying to make sense of what's going on. But afterwards, you'll be much happier for the knowledge. So there's just kind of 5 things I'm going to go through tonight. Going to do an introduction to self-perception theory. We're going to create a character who we call Dr. Dan, and we're going to look at how he was manipulated. And I'm sure lots of you know many medical professionals that were. We're going to look at a couple of the studies on self-perception theory, and then you can see from these studies how this information has been in the hands of a number of people, and then how Dr. Dan will rationalize his beliefs, believes he's done the right thing for the greater good, etc. And then we're going to, at the end, which is quite an interesting segment, we're going to contrast that with Dr. Sarah, who didn't comply, and why she didn't comply. And that's a question that I get asked pretty much every time I present. How did I see it and others didn't? So we're going to have a look into that. So, as I said, this is going to be part of a series, 4 or 5 parts. And I think when you've seen the 4 or 5 parts, you'll have a very good understanding of human behavior. So what is self-perception theory? Well, it's when we're unsure what we feel or believe, we figure out what we really think by observing our own behavior. So if you were to sign a petition about something where you possibly only signed it because you were just being pleasant, what happens in the mind is it will watch that and think, oh, I must really support that thing. So self-perception is like reading your own diary after the fact. You flip through the past entries, your actions, then decide what kind of character you must be. So this effectively works in reverse of what we think, where identity and beliefs drive behavior. And whilst they do, they're actually built initially from observing your own behavior. So when you think about what you believe about yourself, you must have had some evidence, and that evidence was the behavior in your experience. Now, as you'll see through this presentation, this explains the neuroplasticity field, where a person's brain can change shape in as little as 6 weeks. And usually what's going on is that the stimulus to change that is different from their day-to-day routine. So the reason that people don't change is because they do the same things over and over again. When you start to do something different, that's when things change. And obviously there are lots of interventions at the belief or identity level, and they can be very powerful. But this self-perception theory is another very, very powerful way to shift people's opinions and beliefs. So let's have a look at an example which I've used before. And in this study, what they did, a group of researchers went to a neighborhood and they said to people, can we put this big sign, please drive carefully, in your front garden? And only 17% of people said yes. With a different group of residents, they got them to sign a petition just supporting safe driving laws in the area. And they went back to those residents 2 weeks later, and it actually went from 17% up to 76%. Now that's a startling difference of people signing of literally allowing a sign in their garden. And this sign was pretty large and ugly. Now, the mechanism from which that is happening is actually self-perception theory. So the act in signing the petition, the person's looked at themselves and said, oh, well, I must be a person that cares about safe driving laws. So then when they came back 2 weeks later and said, oh, we want to put this sign in your garden, for a lot of people, it no longer felt okay to say no. They felt like it was contradicting their self-image now. So that's a very, very powerful study. Now, there's another study that was actually comes from that book, The Science of Practice of Influence. And in fact, it might come from the second book in the series by Robert Cialdini. And it's quite a manipulative technique, but it really shows how profound someone's behavior can have an effect on how we see them. So a salesman would go into a house and he would be showing people, I think it was fire alarms. And then halfway through the presentation, he would actually, when he finished, he would have to give them a quiz. But halfway through, he said, oh, I've forgotten something out my car. Can I go back and get it? Is it okay to let myself back in? And we was quizzed on this by a Cialdini who sat with him. And when he eventually owned up, he said, look, if somebody lets you back into their house so you can let yourself back in, you must be a trustworthy person. So what happened in the people that said yes to him letting himself back in, they then sort of categorized him into a trustworthy person. And what happened was he was actually the top salesman by far. And the only thing he was doing was that, which is quite astonishing, really, when you think about it. But when we understand in another series, we're going to go into the adaptive unconscious, we effectively have a part of our mind that stores information on who do we trust, who do we like, who do we dislike, all of these things. And that act that the salesman did actually got him to be put in the trustworthy category. Right? And that's quite a manipulative technique, but it shows you how behavior can have a very powerful effect. Now, I started this line of research pretty much from watching this one TED talk that's on YouTube, and it's on the 3 myths of behavior. And it's a very interesting talk. I mean, the woman's quite woke and annoying, but the actual, which is pretty much the same of all the research I go through. Most of the people on research perception cannot see their own perception. We never can see our own blind spots, I guess. But she was talking about 3 myths of behavior. And one of them was people just need more education. And obviously we spoke about that on many calls. It's not about information. It's much more than that. She said people know what motivates them. And obviously we discussed that as well. A lot of the time we don't know what motivates us. And sometimes we're very motivated by things, and other times we're not, by what we think would motivate us. So we're not, as a species, very good at understanding what motivates us. Some of us are, some of us aren't. So those 2 points, 1 and 3, really didn't surprise me in any way. But number 2 really did create a bit of dissonance in me. And it says that it's actually a myth that you must change behavior and attitudes before you can change behavior, or beliefs and attitudes before you can change behavior. So effectively what they're saying is you don't have to really play about with people's beliefs and attitudes. And that contradicted a lot of the models I've learned, because we are taught that identity, group identity, etc. drives behavior. And whilst it does, when you want to change those things, it seems that the quickest and most efficient way of doing that is actually getting someone to change their behavior first. And one of the examples they use that if you just say to people, oh, switch your light off at night or to save energy, when a person does that, then they become a energy conscious person. They start thinking about other ways to do it. That makes sense? And I think I had an instinct about this, that when I would consult to the safe 5G guide, to get rid of 5G and the EMFs, etc., I said to them, just start very small, get someone to turn their Wi-Fi off at night. And then, of course, they start being conscious that EMFs might be an issue. So, there was always a bit of an understanding of it, but it was actually this bit that when I looked into it, made me realize just how profound starting with behavior can be. So the truth is that beliefs and opinions actually get formed from our interpretation of both our and other people's behavior in situations. That's how they originally get formed. So when most people, when they choose a political party, and I use the word choose loosely because most people don't, they usually copy their parents, and then they vote. That's when they voted, that's who they then become, and that's why that stays as a constant, unless, of course, anything else happens. And there are reasons why this wouldn't happen, and they're the 9 that we're going to go into at the end. So the attitudes before behavior, the myth says I can't get people to change unless I first change what they believe or how they feel. When the reality is that attitudes follow behavior in many, many experiences. Expectations and cues that get people to act will later show up as the new attitude when you measure it. Now, how many people can start to think about what's coming there? It's the new normal. Can you see how they wanted everyone to do different behaviors? And it's by doing those different behaviors, that's what shifted people's attitudes and their opinions. And it happened in a sort of gradual way that people didn't realize that they were being nudged from many people like were liberals and turned into Nazis in a very short space of time. Those mindsets, they become very, people should have a choice over their body to let's hold everyone down and do whatever we want to them. So you can see now why so many of the government interventions were just getting someone to do something. And a lot of the time that something at the beginning wasn't particularly big, like putting a banner on Facebook or social media or putting a sign in your window. Or in the UK, it was going outside and banging pots and pans. Now, that was a very, very effective way for people then to see themselves as somebody that supports the NHS service, which, there's obviously good people in there, but it's not run very well and it costs the British people a lot of money. So there was a lot of people that would have a lot of complaints about it. But if you're starting to bang pots and pans, you suddenly don't realize that you're a supporter. Now, what's very interesting about this is that a lot of people will change their opinions and attitudes because of the behavior, and they won't remember their previous attitude and behavior. And there's a lot of studies proving this. And that's why you'll see people who suddenly become aware say, no, I always knew it was, lies, etc. Because their new behavior is shifting their reality and their beliefs. And we see this in a lot of ways in people's lives, in that when someone joins a gym and then they go to the gym regular, they then suddenly see themselves as a fit person or a gym goer. And then it becomes a habit. But it's that initial phase that's so important. And I will go in a different presentation how to get that initial phase well, to design it well. Because when you design it well, you can actually install behaviors very quickly and very easily. And it's sort of counterintuitive because, in fact, what you want to do initially is make it very, very easy, almost too easy. Say for a gym, for instance, you would literally only go to the gym for 5 minutes, celebrate the fact that you went to the gym, reward yourself, and then you will actually want to go back to the gym. But what do most people do, and particularly personal trainers, they work someone out too hard, the person can't walk, they feel terrible, and they never want to go back. So it's very interesting when you understand the structure of that. So, reading a book, for instance, if somebody persevered for a month, then they suddenly might start seeing themselves as a reader and they might enjoy it, etc. And that becomes part of their identity. And obviously, pensions because people are enrolled automatically. When they do that, they then will possibly start seeing themselves as a saver. So a lot of our society, as you will see, is geared around getting people to do things. Once they've done those things, then they start to see themselves as the person that does those things. And then suddenly what you've got is you've got a culture or a society's opinions, beliefs, etc., being molded by the very things that they do. So let's look at how Dr. Dan was manipulated to comply. So a character, Dr. Dan, and you probably all know a dozen of these people, and they will say to you, but I'm rational. Okay, I'm evidence-based, and I'm open-minded and not easily influenced. Now, if you think about any of the doctors that went along with a lot of policies that didn't make sense, it's laughable, isn't it? That they were none of these things. But to their conscious mind, they would be all of these things, because that's what happens in the dual indoctrination, is that people are taught to not be evidence-based, to just do as they're told and believe whatever they're told. But they're also told that they are, in fact, evidence-based and open-minded. So it's kind of this dual messaging. So with Dr. Dan in private talking to one person, he might say things like, oh, I'm not convinced the official line adds up, or some of these studies seem a bit weak. But you see, the real push comes when he's in a group meeting with a senior professor, his superior, and the senior professor confidently repeats the official guidelines and subtly mocks the conspiracy theorists. Dan stays silent and nods along. Because he's staying silent and nods along, his actual adaptive unconscious, that part of his mind that's governing his identity, notices that. And over the months, this pattern repeats. And whilst it seems quite unbelievable that he's actually going to build his self-image of himself in these situations from that behavior, the studies show, and in fact the evidence, if you look at what happened over the last 6 years, that's exactly what happens. And then of course people are rewarded for virtue signaling, getting likes from others in the community by following the rules. So then when they follow the rules, they start believing in the rules. They don't follow them because they believe them. They follow them because they're forced to follow them, because that's the indoctrination from school. And it's the sheer fact of following them that gets them to believe them. It actually works in reverse. Well, it works both ways, to be honest, but it works in reverse. So Dan explains this to himself like this. I didn't speak up because the data wasn't strong enough yet. He obviously cannot admit to himself, I'm just a sheep and I'm doing as I'm told and I don't want to rock the boat, because that doesn't fit with a powerful self-image. So what you'll find is that the rationalizations will always be socially acceptable and they will see the person in a positive light. So the brain is literally going to come up with very powerful rationalizations, and a lot of them will sound on the surface feasible. And a lot of them won't, but that's what happens. And so they say, oh, that meeting wasn't the right place to raise concern. So the fact that he's now not saying this further embeds the belief that it must be true. Now, this is where people get very confused, because the brain is caught in this trap where it has to fall on one side of the fence in a lot of instances. So then they're like, oh, I just believe it. It must be true. But they don't really know why. And it's because of their behavior is one of the main reasons. So I'll say something when it really matters. Okay, so again, it's just, rationalization. So actually, this is what's fascinating. He believes his attitude drives his behavior. I stayed quiet because my rational evaluation told me it was correct and evidence-based thing to do so. But in fact, his behavior is highly sensitive to who is in the room, not just what the data says. And he consistently speaks more freely when there is no status threat. He consistently falls in line when authority and group norms are salient, i.e. when they're relevant. So what's really key here is the fact that he's actually done all of these things. He's followed along. He's reverse engineering his attitude towards these policies from his own behavior. Because that's how self-perception works, in the way that we've learned to live in society over the last few thousand years, it's worked that way to fit in with the tribe, and to align our beliefs, etc., and get on and create some sort of harmony. But when you have a group of people intentionally creating these situations in order that his attitude and his beliefs will fall in line, that's when we've got the problem. So he repeatedly behaves as someone who protects status and belonging. So over time, his true self-image is just seeing himself as part of the tribe, but his projected self-image will be, of course, the rational, evidence-based person. But everything about his behavior will contradict that. And of course, if you point that out, that is when you're going to see him hit dissonance and attack you verbally. Okay, so let's look at some of the studies on self-perception theory. And again, you're probably in this stage now where it's like, wow, this is kind of mind-blowing, because it is kind of unbelievable. But the more you look into it, it's self-evidently true that this plays a major part, not the only part, but a major part in how we build our beliefs, identity, and self-image. And of course, belief doesn't make something true. And of course, everyone in the various quarters of, whatever opinion they're taking on the way the world is working at the moment, pretty much most people think their view is true. But of course, everyone cannot be true, can they? So it's really important to apply objective measurements, even if the data may startle us. So this was a very powerful study that it was known as the BEM study. It was really a study to test BEM's theory, and BEM's theory was that people build their attitudes and opinions from what they're doing rather than the other way around. So they created a series of forced compliance studies where participants were induced to express attitudes that didn't match their initial views. Okay, so they assessed their views and then they got them to behave or write an essay, etc., to express the opposite attitudes. So participants rated their attitude towards an issue. They were then led to write or state an opposing position to what they believed. Later, when asked again what they truly believed, their attitudes had shifted towards the position they had just advocated. Now that is mind-blowing. Now, people will deny that's the case, but in fact, they keep doing it time and time again. I even came across a study where they recorded people's opinions. They went back to those people 3 months later, and they said to them that they had answered the opposite opinion. And they said to them, why did you answer that opinion? And then the person justified it, even though the person had actually answered the complete opposite. So what you find is, if people aren't clear about their opinion or attitude, and my guess is that most people here are, but when you're fuzzy about your attitude towards something, people make it up on the spot. Now, I've actually tested this in my sort of social circles of, sporting places where people are not well versed on these subjects. And I see people's opinion almost just made up on the spot. One day they're in favor of this, the next week they're in favor of the opposite. It's really whatever the flavor of the day or what everyone else is agreeing to, they just nod along. And that tends to be the majority of people that don't hold a clear opinion on something. So they said to him, oh, what do you think about this? Well, their kind of mind said that. So they looked at their own behavior. And because their recent behavior stated something, if the internal signals are weak or not salient, and that's what I meant by if you're not clear on what you believe, then people read their public behavior as evidence about their real views. So if you can get someone to put a Facebook, I support or I stand with, etc., they're effectively going to change their self-image to be very supportive of that cause. They won't know anything about that cause. That cause might violate many of their values, but it doesn't matter because they're literally doing it to get the sort of status symbol, and then their attitude changes towards that group of people or subject or whatever it is. So what Bem showed is that people often do not recall or assess the original attitude. Okay, they infer it from their own recent behavior. So this is the thing, if you can get someone to do something, and of course this, people may start to think, is that why fake it till you make it is one of the subjects that people talk about. And it's true, if you can fake it well, then you will start to get that attitude. It's like when the mask mandate came in, people had the observation of watching themselves wear a mask, and then they concluded, it must be the right thing to do, and then they rationalized their way into wearing the mask. When really, the reality was the only reason they wore it was because they were forced to. And that's why false compliance is a very, very powerful manipulation technique, and really should never actually be used on the public, in my opinion. So the conclusion of study 1, the BEM study, was first, I get you to repeatedly act as if you believe X. Later, when asked what you truly believe, you look back at your own behavior and said, well, given how I've behaved, I must actually believe X. As crazy as that is, that's what the data says. And if you think that was true, that would explain a lot of the behavior that we've seen over the last 6 years. So there was a case study that I came across that kind of blew me away at the time, but it kind of makes sense now when you think about it through the lens of self-perception theory. So this case study comes from prisoner of war camps with communism. And what they would have is they would start with tiny, harmless statements. So if it was American prisoners of war, they'd say to them, the United States has made mistakes like every other country, isn't it? No country is perfect. So what they're doing is they're looking just to get their foot in the door and then just keep increasing that pressure. Then they would sometimes write a short sentence or answer a question in a way that conceded one small point to the Chinese view. At this point, most prisoners would have said, my attitude is strongly anti-communist. I'm just making a small strategic concession. But what these POWs didn't realize is that the self-perception theory is so powerful in the unconscious mind that those small increments over time actually got them to change their beliefs. And this was trained soldiers actually turning communism, and there was many instances of it, and they would get them to read it out over the tannoy, etc. So this was really start with tiny harmless statements, turn small statements into written commitments, and then just let the self-perception and consistency do the work. And then over time, they would shift their beliefs. And that, whilst that seems hard to believe, that's what happened. And of course, a little joke to put the WHO flag in there, but that's of course what's happening. When people are working for these organizations, they start to behave in a way where they're told to behave, and then they start believing that's the right thing to do. So Dr. Dan rationalizing. I act because I believe. Okay, look, I only go along with something if the evidence stacks up. But we know that isn't true, don't we? I mean, that's contradictory to the evidence, but that's what they said. I'm not swayed by group pressure. I speak up when the data demands it. No, you don't. You do as you're told and you follow along. This is Dan's conscious model. First comes attitudes, then comes behavior. But what Dan actually does, when senior figures speak confidently for position X, Dan stays quiet or nods. When someone gently questions X, Dan avoids eye contact and later changes the subject. In private, he admits, I'm not really sure about all of this. But Dan acts as if he solidly supports X whenever authority and peers are watching, and then he starts to attack anyone that doesn't support X. But a lot of this is going on outside of his awareness. So how behavior rewrites belief? Later when asked, what do you really think about position X? Dan pauses. Inside his feelings are muddled. He can't easily retrieve a clear original attitude. It's fuzzy. So he unconsciously does what Bem's self-perception theory predicts. He looks at his own pattern of behavior as if he were an outside observer. And then, well, I've nodded along in meetings. I've never objected. I've even defended X in conversation. So I must basically believe X is right. Now, when you think about some of the crazy things that people believe right now, you can start to understand that the brain is basically just watch them done, like doing things and supporting things, and then think, well, if you've done that, you must basically believe that, even if it's ludicrous. Okay, and some of the things like, oh, you're barking like a dog, so you must be a dog. Okay, it was literally, I saw a video the other day where a woman, was identifying as a dog, and she got attacked by a real dog. Because she was barking at it and stuff. And that just shows you that when you get people to do stupid things, people then start to believe stupid things. So in Bem's terms, when internal cues are weak or ambiguous, people infer their attitudes from their behavior. And of course, it's key to understand that when their internal cues are weak or ambiguous, if you've got a strong moral code, then you weren't going to fall for the nonsense. If your moral code was not clear, or weak or ambiguous, then there was a good chance that someone would fall for it. So Dan's story, my strong pro-X attitudes causes my pro-X behavior. I'm just following the evidence. But the actual truth is repeated public alignment with X, going along with it, not to rock the boat or whatever, silence around doubts when status is at stake, and occasional defense of X to others. The research is clear, and obviously we've seen a real life experience of this. Okay, so let's have a look at why Dan complied, but Dr. Sarah didn't. Now, we've distilled this down to 9 reasons, but there's undoubtedly more, etc., etc. And that's what's really important to understand, is that when we look at something, a problem or whatever, we often fall for the single cause fallacy, as it's known. We think something's caused by one thing, but it's normally a lot more complex than that. So the reason that Dr. Dan changed but Sarah didn't, and we've listed 9 of them, and it could be for any one person, it could be 1, 2, or 3, it could be all 9 of them, could be just one. But what I've touched on is pre-existing attitude clarity. So if you're very clear, for instance, Dr. Sarah was very clear prior stance, medical autonomy is non-negotiable. Doesn't matter what the circumstances are. That's why she did not fall. But Dan was very fuzzy on his view on state power. So because he didn't have a stake in the ground, because he didn't have the hill that he was going to stand on, he was much easier to manipulate. Moral conviction. So for Dan, professional guidelines and best practice was important but negotiable. For Sarah, it's a deep moral principle. Informed consent isn't a guideline, it's a sacred duty. And you would have seen most of the people that spoke up really would mention that. Yeah, because it was very strong in their views. Then we've got number 3, which is awareness of influence. So a lot of people actually think that they're immune to influence. So Dan believes his views are formed by his rational mind, whereas Sarah probably understands the nudge and the manipulation, and that, you can be swayed one way or the other sometimes. So social support was really important. So Dr. Dan was probably around all of his largely compliant social group, where Dr. Sarah may have had even a single ally dramatically increases resistance. And that's why the censorship was such a powerful thing. When you look at group dynamics, if you're the only person, it makes it much harder to speak up. But if there's a few allies, then it makes it much easier. And that's why a lot of people said, certain people speaking up initially gave others confidence to do so. So prior experience, this is massive. So if you so Dr. Dan had limited direct experience of pharma regulatory fraud, so he defaults so they wouldn't lie on this scale. But Dr. Sarah, she had seen it many times. Okay, so she's aware that it could quite easily be fraudulent again. Skin in the game is important, incentives and losses. So Dr. Dan, career, research funding, promotions, etc. Dr. Sarah had a more independent position. A lot of people that had retired felt that they could speak up. A lot of people that had savings there, they had more chance of speaking up. So it's really, if you risked a lot and still spoke up, then it's a lot more admirable, in my opinion, that you really took that risk. Number 7, identity risk. So a person's professional identity is very key to a lot of people, especially if they're ego-driven. Sarah was core identity anchored more in internal principles than in current group line. Priming environment. that was really, whatever environment they operated in. A lot of Dr. Dan say if he's in a NHS hospital, it would have been, these banners everywhere and these signs up anywhere that would have affected him. Dr. Sarah might have been out in a practice on her own. Then hidden goals, motivated reasoning. So basically, Dr. Dan may have something driving him to maintain his self-image. And I've got an article on this flushing out in more detail that I'm quite happy to share. I will put it on the website. But Sarah had already endured disillusionment, more willing to face painful truths about the self and institutions. So the more your livelihood, status, and social world depend on your compliance, the more pressure there is for your behavior to drag your beliefs into line. Now, a lot of people can resist that pressure, but a number of people couldn't. So when your mortgage, your grants, and your friendships are all on one side of the ledger, self-perception is a very strong incentive to discover that you always believed what you're now doing. And that's a rationalization, that people will have. Okay, so I'm now going to open it up to Q&A, but if you want to find out more information, reachingpeople.net, or you can email me at reachingpeople.net. So I'm going to stop recording and then I will open it up